Okay, well, tonight we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel chapters 29 and 30. In our these two chapters tonight, there's one key verse, and I want to jump ahead momentarily just to talk about it. And because really, we're talking about David defeating the Amalekites. You're not going to walk away here tonight thanking God that there's no more Amalekites. It's not going to be foremost on your brain. But what's really in this passage? Well, there, in chapter 30, verse 6, it says, "But David found strength in the Lord his God." And that's what you're going to remember tonight. David found strength in the Lord his God. As we work our way up there, we're going to see everything was going fine for David. You know, he still has this tiff with Saul. But then suddenly, everything in David's life is going to fall apart. Everything. Not only does his king want to kill him, but his enemy, who he is now working for, decides they don't want to work with him. His own men are going to take up stones to kill him, and his wives and children will be kidnapped and gone, but he thinks they're dead. It's a bad day. That's a bad day. But David found strength in the Lord his God. You know, for people outside the faith, when we talk about trusting in God, it sounds either superstitious or silly or wishful thinking to them, but they don't understand what it means that when things are really bad, what does it really mean to trust in God? How do we, in the midst of really bad times, how do we pull ourselves together and go forward? How do we have faith? And that's what we're going to see tonight in David's life. In this chapter, we're going to see him operate in that kind of way. You've probably had that in your life, where things have gone bad and you just don't see a way through. And then only after the fact did you see that, well, not only was there a way through, not only did God get you through that, but in fact, he saved you from something or brought you to something that you couldn't even anticipate, you couldn't even believe. I remember one of the darkest nights in our marriage early on. About a year after our son was born, we were expecting another child, and we were very excited about that. But as things happened, we lost that baby, and just the heaviness of the soul, because then we were losing the baby, and I was leaving a job, and we were moving away to another state, and we had all this heaviness on us. And it would be some time years later when I'm looking at my new baby girl, when I realized she never would have been born had we not lost the other one. And what do you do with that? How do you fix that in your own mind? I don't know, but I know God, and I trust him. And that's where we see David in this really curious time, because here's the kicker. For so long we've seen Saul on the decline, and Saul is far from God, and we've seen David on the upswing. David's exhibiting more and more and more and more faith in God until we get to a chapter ago, and now suddenly David decides to move out of the promised land, move into enemy territory, because he feared Saul more than he trusted God. And it's in this time when David is in the wrong place spiritually, he's in the wrong place geographically, he's not doing things right, but God still is one to be trusted. So here's where I want to begin, and here's where I want to end. Even if you don't do everything right, God can still be trusted. See, God isn't just trustworthy to people who are living perfectly. Sometimes we have that idea, well, I can't trust God because I'm not walking the way I should be walking. Guess what? You can always trust God. You can always trust God. So how do we get there? Well, we got to go through some Amalekites to get there. So I want to jump back, just remind us there were these two verses stuck on the beginning of chapter 28. And the rest of chapter 28, we had this weird story, the medium at Endor. It's kind of interrupted, but the context really began in these two verses. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." David said, verse 2. David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish replied, "Very well. I'll make you my bodyguard for life. Now remember, David and his 600 men had moved down into the area of the Philistines because the king of Israel, Saul, wanted to kill them. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so here is David living in the wrong place, working for the wrong guy. That's where the story picks up. But though Achish is kind of cool, and Achish has his ego stroked by David, this guy that, killed his thousands and his 10,000s, now he wants safety from me. He wants my protection, so he's going to live under my auspices. Achish, turns out he's the only one that feels that way. And so David is going to be sent packing. We pick up in chapter 29, verse 1. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. So the context, again, the Philistines are getting ready to do battle. Why now? Because everybody knows Saul is doing poorly. Saul is not doing well. He's fixated on killing David. He can't find him right now, and he's proven to be a soft target. So the Philistines are getting ready. Now, geographically, this is where the battle is going to take place. You've got the Mediterranean, you've got the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee up here. And so they're going to be gathering around here. The forces of Saul are going to be at Mount Gilboa, and the Philistine army is coming up from Aphek, and they're going to meet in the plains to the north. Is this geography important? Very important. You can look at a modern map today, and I can tell you if you want to take Israel, conquer the middle, divide and conquer, and that's exactly what's happening. They're going to split the nation in two. This is a very strategic place to have this battle. They battled here before. In fact, it's kind of ironic. This is the last time we're going to see the Philistines in this book. We're going to see the Philistines battle the forces of Israel. The first time, guess what? Was at Aphek, chapter 4. And the last time is at Aphek. What does that mean for Israel? That means Saul did a poor job. If you're meeting at the end of the book, if you're meeting your enemy in the same place you met them the first time, you didn't do what God called you to do. God made it really clear to Saul, and he didn't do it. He didn't finish the battle. So this is where the battle is going to take place. Let's pick up in verse 2. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching in the rear with Achish. The commander of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Now just stop there for just a moment. When you see the Gentile armies use that term, it's a pejorative. It's a very negative thing. It's referring to them, this is kind of a slur. These are not normal people. We cannot trust these people. What are you doing about these Hebrews? Achish replied, "Is this not David, who is an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." So Achish relies on a phrase that everybody knew. In fact, there was a whole song written about it. Isn't this David who killed his thousands? Saul killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So he says, "Isn't this David?" But the Philistine commanders, in verse 4, were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men?" And then they throw the phrase back at him, "Isn't this David?" They sang about in their dances, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." And among those tens of thousands were Philistines. So the commanders of the Philistine army were not really happy with the king's decision to include David in his battle plan. So he says, "Send them back." Now remember, he had given them this area to the south, this area of Ziklag. He had put him there so that he would be cut off from the rest of the Israel forces. He couldn't somehow regain popularity among the Israelites and muster an army and defeat the Philistines. So from Achish's perspective, David was kept out of the fray. But David wasn't doing what Achish thought he was doing. Do you remember this? Achish was sending him out to conquer other Israelites. But in reality, David was reporting back and bringing the spoils, having conquered other Amalekites and Kenites and other tribes, non-Israelites, to the south. So there was already a lot of deception going on. So technically, though David is a mercenary, we don't have any evidence that he ever attacked Israel. In fact, we're going to have that as a reality here with something we have to think about. Verse 6. So Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. So Achish was still not in the know. I have found no fault in you, which means I haven't figured out what you're doing. David has been deceptive. So on the one hand, we can look at this from a human perspective and from a God perspective, like we can look at any problem in our lives. From a human perspective, you could say David was being crafty. He was learning about the Philistines, knowing full well that he was anointed by God and would become the new king of Israel after Saul dies. So knowing his enemy, he would know better how to defeat the Philistines in the future. You can say from a human perspective, that could be it. But from a God perspective, does God really need David to be a better soldier? Because who gives the victory? Who gives the victory? God does. And David knows that. So from a God perspective, David being down here is not an act of obedience or cleverness or wisdom. It's a lack of faith. He has faith in God, but he doesn't have faith in the situation, and he's kind of playing it coy right now. But Achish is not a king to stand up to his commanders that are reporting to him. So he says to David, now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. This shows the weakness on Achish's part. David was famous for killing one particular Philistine, right? Goliath, right? And he did that as a teenage boy. So don't do anything to displease the Philistine rulers. David's very presence displeased the Philistine rulers, and for cause. So now, just an interesting thing, I want to back up and just kind of something very interesting that as you're reading the Old Testament, you'll see a time or two. It says, Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord, capital L-O-R-D. When you see the all caps in that, it means that in the Hebrew, it is the proper name of God. Now, does that mean Achish is a believer, that believes in Yahweh? No. It's a normal thing in the pagan cultic religions, because they are polytheists, out of respect to name the name of the God you're talking, the person you're talking to. So Achish, there's only two options here. Either Achish is being polite and invoking David's God, Yahweh, as surely as your God lives, you have been reliable. Or he's doing it just as a matter of convention. It doesn't matter either way. There's no evidence he's doing it as a matter of belief. Okay? So he's doing something that pagans do. Doesn't mean he believes in that, but it means he knows that David believes. So it's either just courtesy or he's using it in a way just to manipulate David. Okay. Verse 8, but what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my Lord and King? Now, this verse only makes sense if we remember that David has been deceptive to Achish already, right? He's gone out and he's fought other pagan armies and brought the spoils back, Achish thinking he was fighting Israelite armies. So David has been deceptive, which suggests that here he is being deceptive again. And I'll tell you why I think that. Number one, it fits the context of the story. David can't let on that he's been disobedient to Achish. So he has to, hey, I won in the fight. You got to let me go. Please let me go. This is Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, right? Painting. If some of you are old enough to know that reference, I know that old people are old enough to know that. Okay, if I'm old enough. So the young people go read Tom Sawyer. So David is this bit of protesting, hey, why can't I go and fight against the enemies of the Lord of my Lord the king. Okay, so I think the context says David is being deceptive. There's other reasons we think David is being deceptive. Look at his language. His language is so clever. Because when he says, why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king? Who does Achish think David is talking about? He thinks he's talking about Achish. Because Achish is the Lord his king. Who is he really talking about? He's actually talking about Saul. But wait a minute, Saul's trying to kill him. Yeah, but David is not trying to kill Saul. So David says, I want to go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king. So the enemies of Saul. Who does David really want to fight against? Philistines. These guys, the Philistines. For sure. For sure. So is it possible that in David's mind he was preparing to be the flanking enemy on the backside and going to help Israel win this battle? Certainly possible. He seems to protest it. But there's another reason. There's another reason. And David had to know this because he was on the winning side of this so many times. If David were to fight against Israel, he would put himself in opposition to the God of Israel. That's just not thinkable. I mean, it's just not something we can comprehend knowing David as we do. If David were to do battle against Israel, how could he then be king? And he's been anointed to be king. He's been called to be king. God has appointed him. He is the next king. So it's certainly unthinkable. So again, I think David is clearly being deceptive. And Achish falls for it. Achish answered, I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. I love this language. Pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go with us into battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So the Philistines are going to be, again, camping on the plain of Jezreel, and the Israelites over in Mount Gilboa. This is where this epic battle is going to take place. Meanwhile, David is heading back to Ziklag. Not a small journey. It's going to take a few days to get there. So Achish has given in to the pleas of his commanders of the Philistine army, and David is sent packing. So in many ways, this is coming at the low point of David's life so far. He's out of Israel. He's away from the people of Israel. He has these 600 some odd soldiers, but he's not going into battle. He's returning home. And what's often bad can sometimes become even worse. And we're going to see, and I've called this section because this chapter really is David defeating the Amalekites, but to get there, to really get there, is something incredible. Chapter 30, verse 1. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. So 3 days to travel south. Now, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it. So again, the Philistine army is from Aphek, and they're heading up to Jezreel to do battle with the Israelites. Meanwhile, simultaneously with that, we have David heading south back to Ziklag, a 3-day journey, which means the battle of this chapter, chapter 30, and the battle of chapter 31, which is, if you've noticed, in 1 Samuel, the author goes back and forth from David to Saul, David to Saul, David to Saul. But we have a real interesting ending to the book, because in chapter 30, this chapter, we see David going to do battle down to the south. And in next week, the final chapter of this book, Saul is going to be up north, losing his life. I think these battles happened at the same time. So that makes this refusal by the Philistine commanders truly an act of God. David can't come with us. We don't trust him. Let me tell you why David couldn't go with them. David could not be anywhere near Jezreel when Saul loses his life. If he was fighting for the Philistines when Saul lost his life, what would everyone conclude? that he has killed the Lord's anointed. And David couldn't have that. God couldn't have that. For all of her problems, the nation of Israel has been her own worst enemy, time and time and time again. But God would not allow it this time. God is not going to put King David in the mess that's happening in Jezreel to the north. So he sends him to the south. This is for his good. Now, think about this. He's being rejected. He's not allowed to go into the heat of the battle. This doesn't feel like a win to him. This is like getting fired. Just when you think everything's coming together and you lose your job. So many people today, they lose their job or something happens or a relationship is in trouble. And the first thing they think is, God has abandoned me. My life is over. Everything is ruined. And they can't see that actually God is for you. God is for me. God is for us. And bad things can be for our good. But this verse, let me go back. This verse, that's all. You can't read that and say, oh, that's good. The Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it. How bad could it be? Verse 2. And had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. Can you imagine what it's like to have mercenaries come into your town and steal your wives and your children? It doesn't seem that far back, does it? In the light of modern events. And guess what? The exact same part of Israel where things are happening right now. It's the exact same part of the country. It's the Negev in the south. Now here's the twist. Verse 2 is good news. It is not unusual for the Amalekites to go in and kill everyone. Men, women, children. But they come into this town, and this time, they're not under their own control. God is doing something in them. The men are gone. The fighting men are gone. Where are they? Well, they're on their way back. They're with David. They had gone up 3 days' journey. Now they're on their way back. And so all you have at home are all these women, little boys, little girls, and for whatever reason, I think beyond their own comprehension, the Amalekites just take them captive and steal everything, which is normal. I'm not beating up my Amalekites. I'm not anti-Amalekite. It's a normal thing to do in a war. You take all the stuff and you set fire to the town. That's exactly what they did. But what does David and what do they know when they get back to Ziklag and the town is burned? They don't know anything. Verse 3, when David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured. Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. And each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and his daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. King Saul wants to kill him. The Philistines don't trust him. His own men are ready to murder him, to execute him, because their families are gone, probably gone for good, as much as they know. And not only that, the town that they have built up over the last year that they've been living there, the fields they've been farming, the storehouses, the animals, everything's just burned to a crisp. And the men are tossing around stones, and they're talking among themselves. He's not fit to lead us. We never should have left. Why are we even here? We should be in Israel. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Now, some of you have been at that point in your life. You found strength in the Lord your God. Some of you may yet be in that point at some time in your life. If you find yourself there, I want you to remember David. This is really how God works. Because this world is messy and ugly and filthy and vile. God never forgets us. Never forgets us. So what's going on in David's mind at this point? Maybe some self-preservation, anxiety, tremendous loss. He just cried himself out. Have you ever cried yourself out? How do you feel after you cry yourself out? When you don't have, you just wiped, you're physically, you're spent, you're done. And what does it mean? What does this verse mean? David found strength in the Lord his God. This is what you find when yours is gone. His physical strength was gone. His emotional strength, wives, kids, gone. Hero David, there's nobody singing songs about David today. So he found strength in the Lord. Now that is not empty piety. That is a faith that acts. Verse 7. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. Now remember, the ephod was this breastplate that the high priest wore. It had 12 stones on it, 1 stone for each of the tribes of Israel. And then in a pocket behind there were 2 other stones, kept the Urim and the Thummim. And these could be used in a manner of casting lots, a yes and no. You do it multiple times for confirmation, probably. We've seen that happen in this book. And you ask the right question. Maybe you ask it more than once. And these 2 stones show you what God wants. Verse 8, Abiathar brought it to him and inquired, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. Now, there's a lot of parallels here between this story and the one that we saw back where David ended up becoming the husband of Abigail, remember, of Nabal, this fool. Remember, his name means fool. David was reactionary and just decided, I'm going to kill this guy because he didn't give food and provisions to my soldiers, and we had protected them this entire time from thieves and robbers and enemies. And in a reaction, not consulting the Lord, David wanted to go and kill. Now David, this is what it means when he's getting his strength from the Lord. Getting his strength from the Lord means he's listening to the Lord. Because what do you want to do when your town has been burned and your wives have been stolen and your kids are gone? I want blood. I want to kill somebody. I so happen to have an army here of 600. Okay? How many would stop to say, God, is this what you want us to do? That's what it means to take strength from the Lord. So David had learned the lesson, thanks to Abigail's help, back in whatever chapter that was, 25. And now he seeks the Lord's direction. Should I overtake them? Will you give me success? Yes, go pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. Verse 9, David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor Valley where some stayed behind. 200 of them, some stayed behind. Verse 10, 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley, but David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. Now, this Besor Valley is a bit of a mystery, but this is too faded to see right here. But just south of Ziklag, there's these little dotted blue lines here, and they head towards the coast. And these are where the modern day wadis are, an oasis in the desert. And it was probably one of these in the Besor Valley. So he's just south of Ziklag here. Of course, who has all the people and all the booty from Ziklag? It's the Amalekites. They're down to the south, so it's going in the right direction. So they begin to pursue the army. They get to one of these wadis, and 200 of his 600, a third of his army says, we're too tired. We've got to stop here. We'll watch all of our provisions. You guys go on ahead. So he had gotten direction from the Lord. He was on his way, and he loses a third of his army. But does that matter to a man who's trusting in God? Now, does this remind you of another story? Reminds me of Gideon. Remember, Gideon had a big army and he trusted God, and God kept whittling his army down until it was almost nothing. Why? Because the battle is the Lord's. It's the whole point. It's the whole point. Now, keep in mind, this is important. So how many men is now David going south with? Say 400. 400. 400. Remember that number, okay? Verse 11. They found an Egyptian in a field, brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a pressed cake of part of the cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. That's what we're having for dessert tonight. Not really. I thought of it after the fact. I said I should have asked Angela to make a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived for not eating any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, who is this Egyptian? Verse 13, David asked him, who do you belong to? Where do you come from? He said, I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. By the way, just a little side note. Every population on the planet has been enslaved at some point. Okay, here's an Egyptian slave of an Amalekite. Right? That's all I'm going to say about that. Okay. Okay. Do with that what you will. So this slave is, first of all, notice that he's hungry and he's thirsty. He has not eaten. David asked, verse 14, we raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. Okay, so we're on the right trail. So this guy is not one of the soldiers. He's the slave of one of the Amalekites that did that. David asked in verse 15, can you lead me down to this raiding party? He answered, swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. So we've already established David could be bloodthirsty, but instead he's full of faith. Well, let's not discount the fact that of the 600 men, now 400 moving on, they're all looking for some payback. It would be unsurprising for them to kill this Egyptian, force him, torture him, until he gave up the direction. But ever since David's tutelage under Abigail, when he learned really about control and trusting God, we see David as kind of a different person. So the slave, the Egyptian slave, wants safety from David. David gives it to him. And verse 16, he led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling, because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. Verse 17, David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, and none of them got away, except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. Well, there's an interesting number, isn't it? Okay. We don't know the size of the Amalekite army. We only know that the ones who ran away in fear was the same size as the army that David had, which means they were a vastly superior force, because fighting all day long, David and his men have killed people all day long, and only towards the end of the day do 400 of them get away. So the battle is the Lord's. This is a very Gideon-esque moment where David's small army defeats a much larger army with a kind of a home position. So this is an incredible, incredible victory. And it says they rode off on camels and fled. By the way, if you didn't know this, camels are the fastest animal of the desert. And so this is how they made their getaway. I believe had they been camelless, David and his men would have caught them and killed them, but they had camels, so they got away. Verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, this is David's plunder. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because I want you to realize that David is unaware of the battle that's being fought by the Philistines and the Israelites up to the north. He knows there's a battle happening. He doesn't know the fate of King Saul. In fact, he's not going to find out in this chapter. But what does he know? does know God has a call in his life. He was anointed by Samuel to be the king of Israel. And he knows that even though he had multiple opportunities to kill Saul, he chose not to because he didn't believe it was his role to kill, to touch the Lord's anointed. So he did. And now he's got all of this plunder. He's the commander of the army. It's normal to give it to his men, but what about to everybody else? This is where things get real interesting. Because plenty of commanders would keep that plunder for themselves, and he purchased to themselves. David operates a little bit differently. Verse 21, then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind in the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. Because all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, but all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. This would not be unusual. Verse 23, David replied, no, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. And this is really where we're starting to see what makes David different than Saul. Saul would take credit. David gives credit to the Lord. We faced a superior force. There was on a home field advantage, and he defeated him. He gives credit to the Lord. Verse 24, who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike. Now it's interesting, verse 27:5 says, David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. We didn't need a new statute, but it makes sense that he did this because at this point, Israel's faith and following of the law is tenuous at best. I say tenuous because we see them turn to the law of Moses time and time again. It's always kind of surprising when they do. But perhaps David knew that in the law, this was actually a requirement. We can go to Numbers 31, verse 27. Divide the spoils equally between the soldiers who took part in the battle and the rest of the community. This was actually part of the law. But David nevertheless made a statute to say that this is how it's going to be. We're going to operate on this principle from now on. And this is really what starts setting him up as a Christ figure. Is the equal distribution of gifts, the distribution of blessing. No matter the role that you provided, he becomes benevolent to all. We're meant to kind of see something different in him, and we do. It finishes out where there's more spoil. Verse 26, when David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, here's a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. Now, why the elders of Judah? Well, it's not just because they're friends. He knows everything's about to change. Look ahead. Who are going to be the ones to recognize his authority as king? The elders. Right? So he's acting like a king before he becomes king. He's being very kingly. That's what we want in leaders, isn't it? We want them to act like leaders. David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Jatir, to those in Aroer, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rakal, to those in the towns of the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites, and to those at Orma. Well, I'm going too fast. There we go. And Borashan and Athak and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. Now, why all that? I'm not going to show you on a map of all these places, but he spread it around. Why? Because under Saul's leadership, the nation had fragmented. Israel was at best a collection of tribal leaders held loosely together by a common interest and a common history as sons and daughters of Abraham. But now, because of all these battles, they are just so very loosely fragmented. Now, David comes in with the spoil of the Amalekites, and he's bringing them back together. He's uniting them. Hey, you're part of us. You're part of us. You're part of us. And so the area of Judah, which is the southern portion of Israel, is already being united together. And that's very intentional and very, very much a kingly action. In fact, when we look at this chapter, we see a lot of things that make effective leaders. Empathy, verse 4, faith in verse 6, 8, 23, and 29, decisiveness in verse 10, kindness in verse 12, persistence in verse 17, integrity in verse 23, fairness in verse 24, generosity verses 21 to 31. And that's just a start, and that's just in David. This this book is about to come to a close. We still have one chapter about Saul, which will be next week. And then as we get into 2 Samuel, we'll see the ministry and the reign of David. Before we close, I just want to go back and just reflect. When life gets difficult, when life is hard, when life is piling on and you feel like God has forgotten you, what are you supposed to remember? He hasn't. Even if you've done everything wrong, he still knows you. Even if you've messed up every step of the way, he still loves you. Even if every decision has put you here rightly from a human perspective, and you kind of deserve everything you're suffering under, God still wants to draw you back to himself. Even though in this chapter, David did not do everything just right, a couple of chapters leading up to this, God still had a plan for his life. And I believe he has a plan for your life. I believe he has a plan for my life. Why not? He's a great God. He cares about us. He knows us by name. He calls us to himself. So, next time things get tough, and they will, where can you find strength? Find it in the Lord. When yours is gone, his is always there. Let's pray. Father, I want to thank you so much, Lord, for this powerful example of your provision, ordering of the details of life. And sometimes it's hard to believe that you can do that in our life, but Lord, I believe you are. I believe that each and every chapter of our lives has a purpose and a meaning to it, even though we may not know it all until the end. Lord, we trust you. Just help us to remember that and to draw strength from you when all our strength is gone, that we can find that strength in you. For it's